I'd like to now welcome the other half of the AGBU Fred and Ginger team, Andrew Swan. I won't even ask you to guess where Andrew studied. Of course, he's another UNE graduate from rural science. Spent some time with CSIRO where he really started working in the wool area, and those of you from the Merino background I'm sure will have encountered Andrew. He was heavily involved in the T13 project, the Towards 13 Micron project that CSIRO ran up at Chiswick near Armidale, and has been heavily involved in the Merino evaluation process in terms of technical advice and being active on some of the committees in that side of things. And from there he moved from CSIRO to join AGBU, and I guess the rest, as we say, is history, an integral part of the AGBU scientific team developing LAMBPLAN and MERINOSELECT. So, Andrew, welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you to Sheep Genetics, my friends at Sheep Genetics, who we work really closely with, have a very good and productive relationship, for having me here to speak to you today, and I'm really glad to do that. And one of the reasons I'm really glad to do that is that as part of the celebration of 30 years of genetic gain in the sheep industry. And I'm really pleased that I've had a tiny little minor part in seeing those impressive gains that you can see before you there. So those are obviously genetic trends for our current indexes for the three breed groups. And another way of looking at that actually is to look at the rate of gain. So it's how fast how much the slopes of those lines in the middle there are actually changing. And what I've done is I've actually expressed it relative to the potential gain that you could achieve with a fairly standard breeding program. And the really pleasing thing you can see there is that the rate of gain is increasing across all of the breed groups that we've got today. And especially pleasing to me when I did this the other day was to see that Merinos have made a big jump over the last few years. So that's really great. So we've got better adoption, we've got new breeding and better breeding objectives, new breeding values, and importantly genomics supporting all that. But what about where we go to next? Well, we're on a pretty good trajectory, and you can sort of think that we'll continue on that. There's a lot of traits that will be important to us in the future that we've been hearing about this morning and yesterday, and I've kind of listed some of those there before over there. Peter and Sarah and other people and Kim have been talking about those. A lot of them we've already got breeding values for, but we'll look to the future to develop breeding values for other aspects. So things like survival and longevity, running costs that Sarah was kind of just talking about, and that kind of thing that we'll see new breeding values for in the future. A lot of those things are hard to measure traits, and we've seen how hard to measure traits really benefit from genomic prediction, so we'll need to have well-designed reference populations into the future to support genetic progress in those traits. For breeders, it's a matter of leading the way and having good breeding programs which measure the right traits to support the genetic improvement. And I just wanted to just mention that perhaps breeders don't think like you're not focusing on crossbreeding in your own ram breeding program, but crossbreeding is obviously a really important part of the Australian sheep landscape, and all breeds have a role to play in that regard. So all of those things fit together, and in order to tie all those things together, we need to think about having better breeding objectives and indexes. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of a little grab bag of examples of things that we can do now and into the future with new technologies. In talking about breeding objectives, Peter also, I just copied off Peter here obviously, but a good way to think of breeding objectives is using the triple bottom line philosophy. So you're looking at social side of the equation, which is basically all about societal attitudes to welfare and ethical production of food and fibre. The environmental side, the most pressing thing, the most obvious thing with a drought raging outside at the moment. It's pretty topical these days, is climate change and how breeding can be used as an adaptation to climate change. I've got a little example of that. And then, of course, the financial side of it is what has been the traditional focus, breeding to improve productivity and quality while reducing costs. And I just make the point that all those things interact with each other. So the first example I've got goes back to Kim's talk this morning, how we're about to introduce our new component trait breeding values for reproduction. And I noticed there was a question before about whether we could, whether we would have indexes for those component traits, and the answer is yes. And we've already started doing some work. Kim showed this graph. It shows the economic values for the individual components and how they change with the production level of flock litter size. And so we already have a model for that, and what happens with that model is that as you increase flock litter size, under the conditions that I've modelled here, litter size actually, the economic value actually decreases and it becomes negative down there. So there was another question about whether you would breed for an optimum for reproduction, and so that's exactly what's happened there for litter size in particular. This system is, when the flock litter size is about 1.88, I think it was, there's no further point in improving reproduction, so there's a zero economic value there. On the other hand, the economic value for rearing ability or lamb survival is going up all the time. So what we're interested in is more like this situation where you've got a sheep that have moderate litter sizes but keep all their lambs alive, rather than something that has pig-like litter sizes and you end up with nothing. So this is what that graph is really showing. So like I say, we have got that new model, so I was able to make some indexes, and so what I've done is I've compared them to the current MCP index actually, because it was kind of comparable with with the model that I had. So MCP is an index which just has NLW, so it has the net reproduction rate in it. Actually, what you can see is that doesn't really do a bad job of, like, we're still getting, I should explain what this is. This is just the selection advantage of top size out of the RBV analysis, so it's showing you how much better the top 10% of size on each index is compared to the average of size. So we've got the MCP index there, and like I say, pretty good balance across those traits, even though it's only NLW. And Kim didn't show you a graph of trends, but we observed positive trends in the new RBV analysis for all traits. In the middle here, I've got an index where it's more towards litter size, and you can definitely see that there. So, a big response in litter size there. Whereas over here, I've got a survival index, where I've changed the balance to less litter size, more survival, and you can see the impact of that there. So what we'll have with the new reproduction analysis, and when we bring in these new indexes at some point, we'll have better control over the components, and that gives us the ability to have improved welfare outcomes, leading to better lamb survival and so on. So more targeted breeding objectives. Also note that genomics is an important thing here. These traits have low heritability, especially rearing ability relative to litter size, and getting better genomic predictions, better reference data is important here. Okay, so my second example is about breeding mules-free merinos. Jeff Linden mentioned last night the positive story there, but basically we've got ASBBs for indicator traits. There's wrinkle, there's breech, cover and dag. I'm focused on wrinkle here, so what we're interested in is sheep like that, and not like that, and certainly not like scientists who worked for 30 years in genetic evaluation. So to date, we've had the tools there in the sense that we've had the breeding values for the individual traits, so people could do independent culling by looking at the index and then the breeding value for wrinkle. But we've recently done a custom index job for a merino breeder, grass merinos, and they decided that they would like to introduce breech wrinkle into an index. So that's what we're looking at here. Of course, perhaps a better approach is to have fly strike directly in the objective, but that's a little bit difficult at the moment. It's something for the future. And also these are, fly strikes obviously a hard to measure trait, would benefit from genomic predictions. So that's something to think about for the future. So this is just a couple of examples, a couple of options that we presented to grass. We looked at the Merino production index and the dual purpose production index, and we looked at them with and without wrinkle. So the standard is just the current index, and the wrinkle is the wrinkle enhanced index. And what I've done here is I'm looking at the selection advantage of just picking the top 10% of the size that are in Merino Superior size 24. So thank you to AMSI for that. And what you can see is that we get a pretty good, we get a good selection differential of 0.3 of a score in both indexes actually, for both MPP and DPP, and minimal loss of fleece weight. This reduction here of 0.4 of a wrinkle score in the DPP, that compares to if you had have selected directly on breech wrinkle, you would have got a 1 score reduction, but you would have actually lost fleece weight. Okay, so the third example I wanted to talk about was using genetic improvement as an adaptation to climate change. So this is some work that I've actually presented before, but I did it with Phil Graham a few years ago. He had just been working on a large project called Southern Livestock Adaptation, looking at how livestock enterprises can adapt to climate change, looking out to 2030. They did a lot of modelling work there, and we picked up on that. So we looked at 3 different locations in New South Wales. So we got Woolbrook, Yass and Narrandera. You see the rainfall there. I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with where they are. We used grass grow to model the stocking rates for the current climate, which is 1960 to 2013 in fact. And then we used predicted climate data to look at stocking rates, how that would be impacted in 2030 under climate change scenarios. So because of higher predicted temperatures and lower rainfalls, you'll end up having lower stocking rates if you're going to maintain the same ground cover. So yeah, you can see there the reductions in stocking rates that are predicted. So what we then went on to do was we developed breeding objectives they were actually based on the 2030 conditions out of grass grow. So, and roughly at each of these locations, they aligned with the MERINOSELECT standard indexes. So at Woolbrook, we're looking at an FPP fibre production index. Yass was the MPP, Narrandera was the DPP. And the results of that was the predicted index gains that we get out of that were that here's our current gross margins per DSC, and the reduction to 2030, and if we add on genetic improvement using those indexes, we can get back the lost production per DSE and in fact exceed it, except for at Narrandera. But of course that's at a DSE level. Remember, we're also losing stocking rate here, so actually at a per hectare level, we're even with the genetic improvement, we're still not getting to our current profitability levels. So other adaptations are also necessary to cover the loss of the feed base, basically, which is improved pasture, varieties, fertiliser usage and stuff like that. Okay, so the fourth example that I have is really to look at the impact of information and how that changes with different breeding programs, and in terms of the information that you have available to you. So what I'm looking at here is really the impact of genomic information for somebody that was using the Merino production index. So I've modelled 4 scenarios and predicted genetic gain out 10 years. The first one is just a basic scenario. So here we're just looking at very standard kind of breeding program measuring yielding traits of body weight, fleece weight, fibre diameter, CV, and actually weaning weight was in there. So that's my base scenario. The relative gain there is my baseline value. Here I've got, I'm adding on a genomic testing to the top 20% of the flock, and I'm also making a change to the breeding program design whereby I will mate rams a year earlier. So, and this is not mating all rams a year earlier, it's following on from what people have done with genomic technology to do some early joining. It's not doing everything, but it is based on a real situation. So you can see there, adding genotyping gets you an extra 25%. The third scenario here is not genotyping, but it's just doing a more advanced level of phenotyping. So in addition to my basic traits, I've got, I'm doing adult wool traits, adult body weight, and I'm also doing NLW. And basically you can see that I get the same gain there as I did for just the genomic testing. When I put it all together, I get a further appreciable gain there, 50% more gain relative to the average. But the interesting thing about this situation here is that there's actually more than one way to cook an egg. And what's actually happening is that the balance of gain between traits, although the overall gain is the same, it's actually different. So in this scenario here, we're actually getting more towards fleece weight and body weight, whereas down here, I guess for obvious reasons, it's going more towards reproduction. Then when we add it all together, we kind of get all traits, a better combination of all traits. So this example was really just to highlight that, the way you measure, the things that you measure and the way you run your breeding program can change the balance of trait improvement. It's quite an important point, I think. There was another question about what would happen if you do just genomics. I did actually model a scenario that was a bit like that, and it was getting about 2/3 the gain of that. Okay, so the last example, Daniel actually dealt with this yesterday. I'll just go over it a little bit quickly again. So Carcass Plus, as Daniel said yesterday, as we all know, it's been responsible for long-term gains over, almost the whole 30-year period that index has been around in growth and lean meat yield. But as we know, it leads to declining eating quality. And what actually happens is that genomic testing, if you're doing genomic testing and using Carcass Plus, it actually accelerates the decline in eating quality. And that's a really important point, that when you're doing genomic selection and it's increasing gain, you've got to really be sure that the breeding objective is right. So Daniel covered this yesterday, so I'll just go through it fairly quickly. This is the new index that we've got, terminal carcass production, TCP. I also call it top chop, and it'd be good if everybody else did that too. But you can see that relative to Carcass Plus and eating the EQ index, it's giving you an intermediate but positive improvement in eating quality. Yield is maintained, and growth is slightly less than Carcass Plus, but it's still pretty good. These are actually the genetic trends that we see in the super white group, and what they've actually achieved is actually pretty much in line with what this index is doing. Perhaps they're doing a little bit better with IMF, but shear force is about the same. They're still making good gains in lean meat yield, and overall the index is actually better than I would predict. So just finishing up, looking ahead, the challenges we have to keep on making sustainable genetic gain. We need to keep focusing on productivity and quality, reduce cost of production in challenging environments, and improving and monitoring welfare standards. And the solutions that we have are our current and new sheep genetics tools that we're developing. So breeding values for new traits, better breeding objectives are really important. We need to keep working on them. Need to keep developing genomic resources to support genetic improvement in hard-to-measure traits in particular, and we need to have well-designed breeding programs to take us in the directions that we need to go. So just finishing off, just to acknowledge the people that I work with and MLA, the Sheep CRC. This is the team at AGBU. Mine is Daniel, who was down doing important MERINOSELECT and LAMBPLAN work that day. But thank you very much.
Questions will pop up on here.
Okay.
Thanks, Andrew, for sharing your thoughts there and some future opportunities for the industry. And Daniel, I reckon Top Chop might have legs by the audience response, so there's a challenge for you. Okay, Andrew, let's have a crack at a couple of these questions.
I can't actually see any of the ones that I submitted myself.
Oh, didn't you? Oh, that's a shame. Maybe there's actually some people out there got some questions we should answer. So will merino indexes get reviewed and changed soon, given the change in economic values of revenue and feed costs?
Yeah, so merino indexes, the current ones we've got have been around for 5 years or so. They do have feed costs built into them, so there is an element of system efficiency that goes into them. But you know, we'll be looking pretty closely at the work that Sarah and her colleagues are doing to look at how we might improve the model that underlies sheep object to produce those indexes. So yes, we will be doing that soon.
Very good. Now, you showed some scenarios there that you'd worked on with Phil Graham in his DPI days down at Yass. So which of those, the traits were emphasised more under those climate change scenarios?
Yep. So there was, as I said, they were kind of like the standard indexes that we've got. So the traits that were in them were fleece weight, fibre diameter, it was actually mature size, and NLW. So it depended on the index, but obviously at Woolbrook, it was a fibre diameter story. At Yass, it was more towards fleece weight. There was also negative pressure on adult weight at both of those sites, so there was emphasis to reduce that. That's probably a weakness of the analysis, that we didn't have the early body weight in there. At Narandra, it was a dual-purpose enterprise, and the focus there was on body weight and reproduction, increasing them.
Thanks, Andrew. So bumping around in order here a bit. We'll go to that second one. From the merino perspective, flocks are only recording litter size. Are RBVs on the horizon there? Maybe stepping back a little into Kim's previous talk.
Yeah, so we will, you know, the plan is to release RBVs for the maternals in a month or two, and immediately after that we'll be working on the merinos to see what happens there. I'm not really sure how the data is going to look. Certainly we always get more data on litter size, and we would definitely like to see people recording the dead lambs so that we can get better information on rearing ability. It's up to breeders and, well, to everybody to work together to make sure that we get good data on that. But you know, if you make an effort there, you will get breeding values for that trait.
Thanks, Andrew. Let's just slip to the bottom question there while we're around that reproduction type story. Use survival in the merino indexes.
Yep. Yeah, it's technically possible sometime in the next 30 years. Yeah, no, it's we don't have that as an immediate priority, but you know, I think as the Merino Lifetime Productivity Project provides more data on that, we'll know more about it and be able to get a better handle on that. So, you know, that's the trouble is we need to. Will you shave anything?
Daniel's ladies.
Yeah, MLP. We're waiting for MLP. That's the bottom line on that. Will I shave anything?
Okay, let's go to the eating quality story to bring it home, please, Andrew. So I guess start with the bottom one, I think. Is DPP going to have an impact on eating quality, on wet quality, and reducing specifically is the question?
Yes. I don't know the exact answer, but I would expect that it would have a minimal impact because the carcass side of that is not as big in the DPP index because you've got wool and reproduction as well as it is for the terminal side. But, it's certainly something we could check.
Certainly. So let's just do that centre one then and continue that. What's your view on where the eating quality needs to be to hit that maintenance rather than trying to turn that curve around as currently the focus?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't quite know the answer to that, but yes, look, that's something I would have to take on notice, but somebody on the meat science side would be better qualified to answer that than myself.
Okay, we'll take that one on notice for the Sheep Genetics team, maybe some further discussion in a breeder's bulletin in the future on that one. Thanks, Andrew. Could you join me in thanking Andrew for that thought-provoking presentation about future breeding? Thank you.